Hi, it's Kristen Atchison, and this is our second lecture in our language development series, and we're going to be talking about infant-directed speech. It's also called motherese. So infant-directed speech is this specialized register in which we speak to children, in which we speak to infants. So both adults modify their language and children modify their language when speaking to infants. And what's cool about this is you don't do it on purpose. You don't say, oh, look, there's a baby. I need to talk to the baby differently. It just happens automatically. And what's also interesting is that it's not just culture specific. This doesn't just happen in one culture. We see this across cultures in different languages, and we see very similar patterns of speech to infants in this infant-directed speech or this motherese. What we see is different about infant-directed speech as opposed to when I'm talking to you, how I'm speaking in this lecture, adult-directed speech. There's a bunch of things that are different acoustically, so the sound is different. We have a higher mean fundamental frequency, which is just kind of, you can think of it as pitch. So we typically have a lot higher pitch when I'm talking to an infant than when I'm talking to you. So this is my voice talking to you. Good job! That's infant-directed speech. You can see how much higher that was. We also see repetition of phrases. So we'll see adults children repeating the same things over and over again to a baby, like, what a good girl you are! Yes, you're a good girl! And repeating those good girls. You also see a repetition of prosodic patterns. Prosody is kind of the music in which we speak. And what we see is there's these patterns in speech to infants that are repeated. So we'll see a certain pattern for when we're trying to tell a baby what a good job they did. And we'll see different patterns for when we're trying to comfort babies. We also see hyper-articulated vowels. And if you've ever talked to a pet, it sounds very similar as to when you talk to an infant. But what's interesting is when you compare those kinds of speech, what you see is you only see hyper-articulated vowels in speech to infants and not in speech to dogs and cats and other pets. And the theory behind that is, well, hey, I'm trying to teach baby language. I'm not trying to teach this pet language. So hyper-articulating their vowels is just kind of extending the vowel out, making it clearer for the infant to understand. And again, we're not doing this on purpose. We're not saying, hey, I'm talking to a baby. Better make sure that I hyper-articulate my vowels. That's not happening. Also, we see simplified syntax. The sentence structures are shorter. They're easier to understand for infants as opposed to adult-directed speech. We've also recently started to look at how infant-directed speech looks visually. So this is just the videos of people engaging in infant-directed speech. And what they found is that adults could categorize what the adults were trying to say to infants with just the face alone. They could tell which intent. They could say, okay, they're trying to approve of a baby, they're trying to comfort a baby, and they have a neutral intent. They could also distinguish between adult-directed speech in terms of movement. The movement was very different in infant-directed speech as opposed to adult-directed speech. So not only does it differ acoustically in how we speak to infants, but our facial features differ as well. And that's a newer area that we're just starting to understand more about and how it contributes. So like I said, infant-directed speech is found in many, many languages. For example, French, German, Italian, Mandarin, Chinese, English, and others. We see it, again, in many, many cultures around the globe. And what we also know is that infants prefer to listen to infant-directed speech over adult-directed speech. So then the idea becomes, okay, this is something that's happening everywhere. We're not doing it on purpose. It kind of just happens. We kind of just change our speech when we're talking to babies. And infants prefer to listen to it. So then why? Why is this happening? What is it good for? Why are we all doing this? Why do we all sound like this when we talk to babies? And there's some different theories that kind of look at that. So Anne Fernald came up with 3 proposed functions of infant-directed speech. Why we all do this. Why we're doing this in different languages and different cultures around the world. If we're all doing it, there's got to be some sort of beneficial purpose to it. And the first reason she said was, first, especially when infants are very, very young, infant-directed speech serves to modulate infant attention and their affect. So it serves to attract their attention, control their attention, and to control their feelings, how they're feeling. Again, we talked about comforting infant-directed speech, doing something to calm a baby down. So we'll see a lot different speech pattern for comforting infant-directed speech than we would for others. And we have lots of data that supports this. The second idea is to communicate caregiver intent and meaning. So to be able to tell the baby something without the baby having access to language, without them understanding what those words mean. That the how you say it matters, and to be able to look at that. And the last one is to be able to exaggerate those phonetic and linguistic structure of language, promoting learning. And again, we've got lots of evidence to support this. We talked about those hyperarticulated vowels. There's tons of studies that have looked at language development and in infant-directed speech versus adult-directed speech, and we see lots of those things. For the rest of this lecture, I'm going to kind of focus on this second function, this communicate caregiver intent and meaning, because that's where my area of interest really lies. And so to communicate caregiver intent and meaning, infants have to be able to tell the difference between the categories of intent. Okay, so when mom's trying to calm me down, I have to notice that that way she speaks to me that way is different than when she's trying to tell me I did a good job, when she's trying to tell me not to do something, that all of those sound different. And I have to be able to notice those are different and be able to categorize those. And so we talked about how these different categories do have different characteristics, but the question that I was really interested in is, do these infants, can they categorize the difference between these? And if so, under what conditions? So we know that infant-directed speech, again, differs in different categories. So an approval might look like this when you chart the sound. This is that prosodic pattern I was talking about, those bell-shaped curves. Whereas a comforting tone looks very different. It looks kind of like a falling curve. It looks kind of like a ski slope or something. So we have very different prosodic patterns. So you can identify these categories both by these kind of dynamic features, their shape, but also by summary features. So for example, approvals have much higher pitch. They have a much higher fundamental frequency, which is this first number here, this 347.78. So on average, they have a much higher frequency than, say, a comforting infant-directed speech does. It also has a much wider frequency range. If you're looking at this bell-shaped curves here, it goes from kind of a lower pitch to a much higher pitch, where comforting infant-directed speech doesn't do that. It kind of starts out in the middle and then it falls down. So it has a much smaller range. So we're going to go through some examples of these where they're actually kind of talking to babies instead of me simulating it in front of my computer. So like I said, approvals have these bell patterns or these rise-fall contours. So that's how they dynamically look. And then again, they have this much higher fundamental frequency or this higher pitch than a comfort does. And we're going to play an example.
Great job!
So you could hear that was a higher pitch. You kind of heard it go up. Great job. Comforts, however, have falling contours. Again, they look more like a ski slope. And they tend to have a lot lower fundamental frequency, a lot lower pitch. Now, this is going to be the same speaker. She's just trying to get the baby to do something different.
Don't cry, baby.
So again, you heard this was a lower pitch, a different sound, and you could tell that her voice kind of started a little bit higher and then fell even lower. So again, we can tell these categories apart on a number of different features as adults using different measurement tools. But the real question is, can the infants tell these apart? Can the infants categorize these as separate? And so what we did was a looking task where infants were habituated to one category, either the approvals or the comforts, and then they were tested with the opposite category to see if they could tell the difference. And so I'm going to not talk over this video so you can see it, and then I'll give you a little summary at the end. Okay, so what we saw there, as at the beginning and the end, we had that drum. And that was just to make sure kind of our measure of attention in general, something completely different, but something very engaging to kind of make sure baby was still with us and still cooperating. So we would compare the drums from the first and beginning to make sure that they're just kind of still with us. And then the baby was introduced to 6 different people saying 6 different things, but all saying it in comforting infant-directed speech. And the baby pretty quickly habituated to that. So they just saw each face once in 6 trials. The baby had reached the habituation criterion, which we set at 50%. And then we went into the test phase, and they got 2 of the voices they'd already heard saying the exact same things in the same category just to make sure, yeah, we're really still bored. And they were. Then we went into the real test that we were really interested in. We had 2 approving infant-directed speech. They were the same people that they had seen before, so there wasn't anybody new, but the category of what they were saying was new. If you notice, we got baby's attention back, and he looked a lot longer there. And then the last 2 were new examples of that first category, that comforting category, with the idea being, if baby really notices a difference between these categories, baby's going to dishabituate to the different category, but not the different utterances. So just because those last 2 comforts were new and they hadn't heard those specific phrases before, we didn't expect them to dishabituate to that, but only to dishabituate to that new category. And what we found is that both 4 and 6-month-olds can do this. They can categorize infant-directed speech, and they can tell that it communicates different messages of the intent, but they do so under different conditions. So we know that both 4 and 6-month-olds can do this with approving and comforting infant-directed speech. We've kind of tested this over and over again. And what we found is that the 6-month-olds can do it with just the speech by itself, no picture at all. Or they can do it like we just saw it here, where the face and the voice are synced up and everything's matched up the way it should be. And either one of those ways were excellent. 6-month-olds has of it. But 4-month-olds are a little bit different. 4-month-olds can't do it with just the voice alone. That when we talked about how much babies like to look at faces, how salient, how important faces are to babies. And so 4-month-olds really need a face. Now that face can just be a picture of a random chick and have all these different voices, and that's sufficient. It's just like it cues them in that, hey, this is a voice, you should pay attention to it. And they can do it with, some of the other ways too, when the things aren't matched up as well. So what we see is kind of a shift in what's important to infants. At 4 months, they need to have that information that this is social, this is important, that this is a face and a voice together. They don't have to be synced together, but they have to both be there. Whereas 6-month-olds know that faces and voices should go together. So if they're not going together, if they're not in sync, that we have problems. But either way, we know that this is important, and this is communicating caregiver intent as early as 4 months. Thanks.